This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 226 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the Number Fire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. We talk about data and analytics on this show. It's not that I think that numbers can tell you everything there is to know about football, but they do help spot trends, and they help capture things that our eyes simply can't capture. In the fantasy football world, we're in the business of predicting. We're trying to forecast how players are going to perform statistically in a given season. So analysts, or even just fantasy managers who want to win their home league, we crunch numbers. We try to find things that will help us better predict what's about to happen. But what are those things? What pieces of data matter most when we're projecting player performance? It's a question I get all the time, and it's a question I've tried to help answer throughout the 200 plus episodes of this show. But to dig even deeper on the topic, I wanted to talk to Josh Hermsmeyer. If you don't know Josh, he's the owner and creator of the website airyards.com, which has become a huge resource for fantasy enthusiasts. He's now writing for FiveThirtyEight, and you can find him on Twitter at FriscoJosh, constantly sharing data, discovering new metrics, and standing for Jarvis Landry. I sat down for about 20 minutes with Josh to pick his brain about not just air yards, but other pieces of data that he's found to be predictive. I hope you enjoy our chat as much as I did. All right, Josh, so airyards.com and the work that you've done with air yards as a statistic, it's become a really big piece to the fantasy football community. Can you talk about what led you to creating that site and why air yards have become such a focus?
I guess I created it because first of all, I found the data, and that was just really fortuitous. I was digging through kind of public databases and Python code and R code that was able to at least dip their toe into this Game Center API that the NFL has on their website. And it was really arcane, and none of it was documented very well. And in any event, it led me to kind of digging in a little further, and then I found out that the NFL was actually publishing, incomplete air yards. And we always had complete air yards, because all you need to do is subtract yak from receiving yards to get that. But the piece that we were missing was this incomplete part. The reason why that's important is because it's like this notion of like what was intended to happen and didn't happen. And so anyway, I found that data, and so many things. When it comes to football is just having the data. I mean, I don't think we have a problem with analysts. I think we have some of the best. We just have a problem with data. And so I was fortunate to get my hands on it. I knew it was important when I did a correlation with PFF's ADOT, and it was like 0.99. So I knew I had something good. It was solid data. Mm-hmm. And then really I just went back and read what other smart people had done with depth of target, like Mike Clay. And he had kind of collapsed the data into one number, like that's what ADOT is, the average depth of target. And then what I did was instead spread it out. And I said, well, let's look at every depth and see how players perform. And so after I did that, I thought, this is really interesting. I'm going to make a website, and I did. And that's probably the most kind of fulfilling part of the whole thing, is that it actually gets used. That really is super cool from my perspective, and makes me really happy.
Yeah, I mean, I use it all the time. I cite it on this show all the time. It's a very, very useful resource. Can you explain sort of some of the metrics that you've created that stem from air yards? I know that you've created a few. Sort of talk about why those statistics have been so important in your process, and whether it's real football or fantasy football analysis.
Sure, yeah. And it all starts with fantasy, I think, because it's important to me. Because it's important to me. Like, it's my life. It's the stuff I choose to spend my time on, or my fantasy leagues. And I think it's the same thing with other folks. I think, if you can help them where they live first, that's the most important thing that they respond to. So anyway, I think people who run away from fantasy is a huge mistake. But it does help in real football, because when you adjust for depth of target with something like Pacer or Racer, Pacer is basically, you can think of it as yards per target over ADOT. For a quarterback, same kind of thing for a wide receiver. And it's basically how often he converts a yard in the air into a yard on the ground, whether it's through the catch or the yak after. And so really just kind of, it's a new way of measuring efficiency. It's stickier, in other words, more predictive than yards per target as an efficiency metric. So in the realm of efficiency metrics, it's the best that I found. And then for quarterbacks, adjusting for depth of target turns out to be hugely important. It's really intuitive, but it is the case that a 15-yard deep out is harder to complete than a screen pass. So adjusting for that is get you closer to what a quarterback's real performance level is.
Right. So you mentioned the notion of stickiness, which I think a lot of fantasy managers are pretty interested in, especially those who listen to this show in particular. What type of data have you found that fantasy managers tend to sort of overrate when they're projecting an upcoming season? So we're really talking about statistics that aren't sticky.
Yeah, mostly efficiency metrics, unfortunately. I think we tend to view football volume the same way maybe certain people view like maybe baseball volume, where it's kind of empty. It's an empty metric. It's like, it doesn't really tell you as much as it does in football. In football, if you get a target, that means look, they're not going to, a team, a QB, a coaching staff, a play caller is not going to waste it down on a scrub. So the more targets a guy gets, the more indicative that is of his talent, his true talent, the team's view of his true talent. And then when you leverage those targets and put how many yards are behind them, which is what air yards is, you can get at the true value of that guy in the offense. And so that's what Whopper is this weighted opportunity rating. It takes those two things, turns them into share metrics, and then weights them appropriately, basically 2-to-1, twice as much weight on targets as air yards. And you get this metric that's really, really good at telling you who's likely to be good next year. And so, yeah, I think, but the main thing that folks that I talk to, because you see a guy and you see high efficiency, right? And you think that is evidence of him being a good football player. And I think we can overweight that sometimes. I don't say throw it all the way out, but I think we can overweight it.
Yeah. So, I mean, something that I always talk about on the show is that targets are a skill statistic. I mean, you have to be open in order to get those targets in the first place. Is that a reason? This is kind of a tangent, but is that a reason why you are a Jarvis Landry truther?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Because, and not only that, but he was efficient on his own terms. So, right. Like, if you look at other players who got the types of targets he got, he was hugely efficient compared to them. So, I mean, the argument against Jarvis Landry, which I am totally sympathetic to, is that his targets, or at least before last year, weren't as valuable as targets to, say, AB or, other really good wide receivers. And yes, yeah, absolutely. Don't argue with that. But his targets are way better than a target to a running back. They're way better than a handoff, for God's sake. So, I mean, let's not like throw the baby out with the bathwater. Baby steps to something highly efficient in the NFL is more than welcome, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. So is on the flip side, is there any data that folks tend to underrate or not pay enough attention to? I know that you mentioned volume, and obviously volume is stickier than most efficiency stats. But is there anything kind of more in depth than just simply targets or attempts?
Everyone's so super sharp at this point. I think really the way to kind of leverage data and statistics is to just weight the opportunity properly. I really don't see any other edges. No, there isn't really anything. Everyone's putting probably now the proper weight on we'll talk about this later, but things like athletic measurements, things like efficiency. Maybe they're overweighting too much, so you might have an edge there a little bit. But really, the only repeatable edge I see in fantasy is in dynasty leagues, where in a startup you are not averse to rostering older guys, because there's this really huge bias for young players.
Yeah. People seem to think that they know a lot more than they actually do. It's sort of the approach that I take. So one of the issues that I've always had with testing the significance of certain metrics in football is that almost everything just shows little correlation in this game, especially if you compare it to another industry, let's say. So, some metrics and statistics definitely are bad objectively. But have you found that looking sort of at the extremes, because of these low correlations, looking at the extremes, can that be helpful? And are there any examples of this? One thing that usually pops in my head when I think about this is the NFL Combine. In some, it's really hard to find significance with individual workout drills. But there are a lot of layers to it, since we know that the Combine can help a player's draft stock. It might be able to help immediate volume in the NFL then. And it seems that we can ignore sort of these outliers, or at least put some weight to these outliers, like we saw with Elijah Holyfield running a 4.78, because we know historically running backs who run that slowly just haven't done anything in the NFL. So how do you sort of combat this as someone who's testing the significance of data all the time? Do you just ignore most data, or are you looking closely at those outliers?
So It's a difficult question to answer because really teasing apart when you put all that stuff that you just mentioned into a model that includes things like past production, it's really hard to tease apart what's actually helping. Especially if you use something really like exotic, like a machine learning model that's using all sorts of like sub models inside of it, and actually getting to what's really driving this. It almost always comes back volume, opportunity, and the other minor things are really hard to like rank. But I would say that, for skill position players, for fantasy relevant players, things like speed can be predictive. Like for instance, for guys that are going to be stretch X's, the 40 times, it does actually correlate really well with on-field game speed, that's measured by the NFL. And so if you want a guy like John Brown or something like that, who you're going to use as a stretch X, and maybe he'll get those shot plays, and maybe he will be a guy that profiles as someone you play in DFS, for instance, and might have a big week, then that's actually something that's worthwhile to look at. But really, I think the combine and numbers that are generated there are way more useful for non-skill position players and edge rushers and offensive linemen and things like that. But less important for fantasy.
Yeah, I've sort of found the same thing. I mean, I have a pretty basic prospect model that I run through throughout, once the NFL season's over, and I've just found that college production is just far, far more predictive than simply throwing in all these agility scores and trying to find something through that. But again, I was just curious because you're constantly testing these specific statistics. And you're finding there are great findings as a result, and you're helping the community move forward with a lot of this stuff. And I was just curious if, let's just say for an instance, let's just use this Elijah Holyfield example. If Elijah Holyfield runs a 4.78 like he did, do you see that as a legitimate red flag as I'm never going to draft this guy because he's probably not going to be good, strictly based on that 40 time?
Yeah, I think thresholds matter for sure. And And I can also tell you, talking to folks that actually work for teams, that all those combine metrics are in their models. So,
right.
I mean, it's not the case, again, that people are ignoring it completely. I just can't answer with any real degree of certitude about what level of importance they have relative to other more important things that we know are important. But yeah, no, thresholds matter. We talked about Kyler Murray all this offseason, 5'10", he's too short. There's certainly a limit to how tall you have to be to play NFL quarterback. There's no doubt about it. Right, is it 5'10" though? I mean, I don't think so. But probably 5'6", that you're probably not going to be a good quarterback there. And so I'm certain that if you ran a 5 flat, that you're not going to be good in the NFL. So again, is Elijah Holyfield, does he have other traits, talents? Will he be in a better situation, asked to do a specific thing that can make up for that? I don't know. It's probably unlikely. But I think it takes better analysts than me to make those kind of determinations.
Yeah, I feel you. Speaking of the NFL draft, that's the focus this time of year. I remember you doing some interesting work last year with running back prospecting. Especially, I remember, you were into Rashad. I was into Rashad Penny as well. But you were looking at specific statistics that you found to be fairly sticky with running backs that were jumping from college to the pros. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of touches and broken tackles, and I looked at yards before contact, yards after contact, all that stuff. Neither of those were helpful. It was the simple fact of somehow eluding or breaking a tackle through physical violence. Those things seem to be the traits that we pick up in the data that are actually carry forward and translate into the NFL. Guys like Kareem Hunt and, we have lots of success stories with this. It's, if you can break a tackle, if you can stone a guy and then keep moving, that will translate to the NFL. And then if you're athletic enough to even be invited to the combine, now you put yourself into a special category. Crazy about Rashad Penny. I mean, it really was the case that when he did get some volume, he looked pretty good.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Totally agree.
So I don't think he's like a bust in terms of talent, but it is obviously the case that you can find guys with his equivalent talent in the 6th and 7th round, and that's what Carson is. So,
right.
And I think that just goes to, a topic that's near and dear to your heart that you don't want to talk about anymore, just about the fungibility of running back talent.
Yes. I've kind of retired from that. At least on Twitter. I can't spend the hours and hours of the rabbit holes that you can go down in talking to people about that topic. So Josh, you wrote a really, really awesome piece on 538 about a week ago that was called "The NFL is Drafting Quarterbacks All Wrong," and in it, you found that completion percentage seems to predict NFL success fairly well. But you took that a step further and you found that the difference between completion percentage and expected completion percentage is even better. So, I know that it's a long study. It's a really, really great read. I recommend anyone listening to this to go read that. But can you sort of walk through what you discovered? And is this same metric meaningful with quarterbacks currently in the NFL?
Yes, happily, yes. So to the last part first, you can use that exact same analysis on current NFL QBs and find similar results in terms of correlation with yards per target, in terms of EPA per play, all the things we care about. Completion percentage over expected is a better predictor than anything else we have. So that's great and the reason why that's great, and this is really what I talk about in the article, is because I think completion percentage over expected is capturing things that aren't exactly related to on-field play. It has to do with what's between the ears. And that's the hardest thing to get at, right? It's like this idea of mental processing, football IQ, throwing with anticipation. These are things that are, I think, captured in that metric. I mean, I can't prove it, but I believe they are. And so for me, like, what's exciting about it is it's pushing me towards some future work that I've been discussing with some folks that I hope to publish soon that will kind of get even further at that idea of what's between the ears of the quarterback. Because I think that's what's missing from NFL analytics, because getting the quarterback right is so important. And if you have the wrong quarterback, it may be the case that the NFL talent evaluators are actually better at the rest of the positions than we think. But we put them on teams with bad quarterbacks and everyone suffers, Yeah. And so I think if we get quarterbacks right, maybe these other things improve as well. And anyway, my whole thing with it was that completion percentage, guys like 15, 18 years ago discovered that it was a translatable trait. And I just said, maybe we can make it better. I said, if we adjust for the depth of the throw, maybe that helps. And then if we adjust for the talent level around them in their conference, maybe that'll help. I did both those things, and it turned out that it did help. And then I built a simple model just kind of predicting which of this upcoming class may be the best bets to be good quarterbacks. Kyler Murray, top of the list. There's a surprising Will Grier, number 2. Haskins was 4th or 5th. So, and all these were like, they had better than 50% shot of being above average NFL quarterbacks. So these are pretty good QBs in terms of prospects, which was interesting because people said this was a garbage class and coming in, and Murray actually looks like one of the better ones in the past 3 or 4 years. So
yeah, I thought it was an incredibly interesting piece. Definitely one that people should check out. Josh, thank you so much for hopping on and talking a little predictive data with me today. If any of you aren't following Josh on Twitter, you can find him at Frisco Josh. And I'm, of course, on Twitter at Late Round QB. And make sure you're subscribed to this podcast by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back in your ears Friday with a weekly mailbag episode.